You've heard of the Great Chicago Fire, but have you ever heard of the hungry horse that might have started it all? A nervous mare's twitch in a barn may have knocked over a lantern, leading to a fire that destroyed 17,000 buildings and reshaped an entire city. Lean in close to discover the smallest causes behind history's biggest moments. In the year 535 AD, the sky over Europe began to dim. Not for hours or days, but for months. Crops failed. Winters lengthened. The sun, it seemed, had vanished. But no one at the time realized that the trigger wasn't from within the empire, but far from it. A volcano in modern-day Indonesia. Scholars believe Mount Rinjani erupted in a cataclysmic event, sending sulfur into the stratosphere. The skies darkened across continents. In Constantinople, frost touched the roses of summer. Famine crept across Italy. And into this weakened world marched the plague of Justinian. The Eastern Roman Empire, once invincible, staggered under the weight of invisible ash and microscopic fleas. Trade collapsed, armies shrank, and the mighty empire never truly recovered. A volcano, half a world away, had cracked the shield of a civilization. So next time you look at the stars through soft cloud cover, remember, sometimes history is shaped not by swords, but by smoke. Are you ready to step into the second quiet cause that reshaped the map? In 1871, Chicago burned for 2 days. It destroyed over 17,000 buildings, left 100,000 people homeless, and changed American architecture forever. But what lit the match? Legend says a cow kicked over a lantern in a barn. That's partly true, but the forgotten detail is far more curious. The real spark may have been a hungry horse. In the O'Leary barn, it wasn't just cows. Horses were fed hay that night, and a nervous mare, spooked by rats, twitched against the stable walls. A lantern, hung too low, wobbled, then tumbled. The hay went up in flames. But Chicago had another problem. Sidewalks, roofs, even roads were made of wood. Add wind, and it was a city built for burning. One twitch, one flame, one moment. Because of that one frightened horse, America would learn to build upward, with steel and stone. Skyscrapers rose from the ashes. Isn't it gentle irony that a skittish horse helped shape the modern skyline? The next story reveals a meal that led to revolution. In 1789, France stood on the edge of hunger. The economy was failing. The king's court feasted, and rumors filled the air like flies. But what pushed the people to the streets may not have been just taxes or tyranny. It may have been a rumor about cake. The phrase, "let them eat cake," was never proven to be spoken by Marie Antoinette, but it spread like wildfire. The misunderstanding? It wasn't even cake. It was brioche, a soft, enriched bread. Still, for the starving, the idea that the royals suggested pastry in place of bread was unbearable. The phrase became a symbol, a quiet, bitter catalyst. It painted the monarchy as out of touch, cruel in its comfort. The storming of the Bastille would soon follow. So no, dessert did not swing a sword or storm a prison, but it planted an image, a seed of fury disguised as a crumb of sweetness. Isn't it strange how a misheard snack can change a nation's fate? Let's softly wander now toward a painter who accidentally saved a city. Dear listeners, take a deep breath. Imagine warm candlelight reflecting off dark water. Gondolas drift, but once they almost vanished forever. In 1810, Napoleon's armies were dismantling churches and shipping treasures back to France. Art, relics, gold, all packed into crates. Venice, already declining, faced cultural erasure, but one painting quietly stopped it. Canaletto, a painter obsessed with detail, had spent decades capturing Venetian canals, every rooftop, shadow, and ripple in water. His works, sold across Europe, created a longing in foreign hearts. British nobles, German scholars. They fell in love with a city they'd never seen through his brush. So when Napoleon's men considered draining the canals and transforming Venice into a port town, Canaletto's art screamed silently across parlors and courts. Influential voices pushed back. The plan halted, Venice remained. A brushstroke, not a bullet. And to this day, travelers drift through the city Canaletto painted into permanence. Isn't it lovely to think that color in canvas can preserve stone? The next tale uncovers a storm that crowned a queen. You are right now wrapped in quiet. And so were the Spanish ships on that strange August night in 1588. The Spanish Armada was invincible, or so it seemed. King Philip of Spain had sent it north to crush Protestant England and unseat Queen Elizabeth I, over 130 ships, thousands of soldiers. Catholic Europe held its breath, but nature whispered otherwise. A strange storm brewed in the North Atlantic. The English Navy, smaller but agile, darted between Spanish formations. Fire ships scattered fleets. Then the winds came. A great gale, unusual and perfectly timed, smashed the Armada against Scottish and Irish coasts. Wreck after wreck. Cannonballs drowned. Soldiers lost at sea. Elizabeth called it divine favor. Historians now call it a lucky jet stream. England, spared by wind, rose from the waves with newfound confidence. Colonies followed. Trade followed. The empire followed. So in a way, the British Empire may owe its start to a storm's whim. Funny how empires can rise on a breeze, isn't it? And hey, friends, if you love discovering gentle truths beneath grand events, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. Next, we'll drift toward a scent that changed a war. Hey, friends, close your eyes and imagine the scent of lavender. Now imagine it on a battlefield. During World War I, the British faced the horrors of trench warfare. Gas masks were primitive. Protection was scarce. But one unexpected comfort made a difference: perfume. In 1916, soldiers were issued cotton pads soaked in eau de cologne, not for scent, but survival. Chlorine gas, deadly and green, would roll in without warning. But cologne-soaked cloth, held to the face, acted as a makeshift filter. It wasn't perfect, but it bought time. And for many, that meant the difference between blindness and breath. The perfume companies of London shifted production. Lavender, citrus, rosemary, distilled for defense. Fragrance turned into first aid. Imagine that, soldiers clutching floral-scented cloth while shells fell around them. Sometimes history's harshest chapters contain the softest surprises. Ready to wander next into the clink of silver that changed a king's fate? Dear listener, lean in closer, because in 1547, a simple spoon sealed a legacy. King Henry VIII had many problems, but by the time he reached his final days, his biggest concern was the future of his son, Edward VI. The boy was young, vulnerable, and enemies circled like birds. Enter Sir Anthony Denny with a silver spoon. Why a spoon? Because at the time, only a trusted figure could feed the king medicine. It was a mark of closeness, of final whispers. On January 27th, Denny brought the king a potion, bitter, meant to ease his passing. And with the spoon came a question: who shall inherit the crown? The king, too weak to speak, nodded toward Edward's name. It wasn't a royal decree, not a document, not a council vote, just a nod and a spoon. And so, a 10-year-old boy became king. A utensil became a seal. And the fate of Protestant England moved forward, on a glimmer of silver. Isn't it curious how often history hangs from tiny things? Let's move next into a broken clock that preserved a nation. Hey friends, imagine you're staring at a tall, ticking grandfather clock. Now imagine its silence saving a democracy. In 1973, Chile faced its gravest political crisis. A military coup led by Pinochet aimed to overthrow President Allende. The plan was timed to the second. Soldiers waited for the strike of noon. But the clock in La Moneda Palace stopped. No chime came. Confusion broke out. Timing collapsed. Communications were delayed. That pause, those mere minutes, gave Allende's guards time to react, civilians time to flee, and parts of the world time to hear the call. The coup still succeeded, but the delay changed the script. It preserved documents, witnesses, memories. It added friction to propaganda, all because a clock had not been wound. Imagine that, one frozen cog in a dusty hall ticking louder than any gun, ready to tiptoe into a library where silence saved science? You might be curled under your blanket right now, but in 1943, under Nazi occupation, Maria Skłodowska-Curie's books were curled under floorboards. Not the woman herself, she had passed, but her notebooks, her instruments, and her scientific papers. They remained in a Warsaw library. German officers came looking. Radioactive notes were dangerous after all, but the head librarian, a quiet woman named Elżbieta, hid them under religious texts. Just prayers, she said with a smile. The materials would later fuel atomic theories, medical breakthroughs, radiology revolutions. But in that moment, history was saved not by brilliance, but by silence. A soft footstep, a closed drawer, a whisper of dust. Science survived in hiding, wrapped in pages and trust. Isn't it peaceful to know that sometimes the greatest discoveries sleep under stacks? And now one last story for tonight, a pigeon that won a war. Hey friends, as you drift toward dreams, imagine wings flapping through gunfire. In 1918, during the final weeks of World War I, American troops were trapped behind enemy lines in the Argonne Forest, surrounded, running out of hope. Carrier pigeons were their last lifeline. One bird, named Cher Ami, was their final messenger. She flew through bullets, was shot, lost a leg, but still delivered the note, coordinates, a plea. Stop friendly fire. Thanks to her message, 194 men were saved. The shelling stopped. Reinforcements came. She didn't know of armies, or empires, or maps, just flight and duty. Cher Ami was awarded the Croix de Guerre and preserved in the Smithsonian. Isn't it quietly wonderful how a creature with no words could carry such weight? Close your eyes now and let that thought rest softly on your pillow. You are now slipping gently into the quiet of an old observatory. Outside, stars shimmer. Inside, a man dozes beside a telescope. In 1781, astronomer William Herschel wasn't even searching for planets. He was charting stars. But on one drowsy night, while polishing lenses and watching pinpricks of light dance, he paused and nodded off. When he awoke, the telescope had drifted, and there it was, a faint blue speck that didn't belong. He had discovered Uranus, the first planet found since ancient times. But more curiously, it only became visible because of a nap. His telescope had settled just off course enough to reveal what had always been hiding, a planet waiting for an accidental blink. The discovery shattered the edge of the known solar system. It altered how we mapped the sky. It even prompted new theories of gravity. And it all began with a little snooze. So if you ever feel guilty for resting, remember, some dreams reveal whole new worlds. Next, we'll follow a mouse that ruined an invasion. Hey friends, imagine crunching straw beneath your boots and something tiny darting between them. In 1812, Napoleon led over 600,000 soldiers into Russia. By winter, only a fraction would return. Yes, the cold was brutal. Yes, supplies failed. But there's one odd culprit historians rarely mention: mice. Russian winters are notorious, but so are their field mice. As the army set up camp, thousands of mice crept into tents, chewing through wool, leather, and food stores. Most critically, they gnawed the flint pouches and powder bags used for musket fire. Soldiers awoke to frost, hunger, and rifles that couldn't spark. The Grande Armée, already stretched thin, was now defenseless and cold. One officer wrote, "We lost more to night creatures than enemy cannon." Imagine that. An empire undone, not by battle, but by nibbles. So the next time you hear rustling under your floorboards, think of Napoleon, outwitted by whiskers. Now we turn to a broken pipe that redirected a war. Dear listeners, take a deep breath. Picture the steady drip of water beneath a floorboard. In 1944, the Allies prepared for the most ambitious military invasion in history, D-Day. Plans were drawn, maps were printed. Codenames like Overlord and Neptune filled secret files. But one file cabinet in London had a leaky pipe above it. As the drip-soaked papers, a young clerk moved them to dry. A janitor, curious and unnoticed, peeked at a folder marked Confidential. Within days, rumors spread. British intelligence traced the breach. They discovered a mole, one they might have missed without the wet floor. Because of that, security was tightened. Decoy plans were planted. Fake troop movements were launched. And the real D-Day invasion happened where German defenses were weakest, Normandy. All because of a leak and a mop. Isn't it strange how strategy can shift like a puddle? Let's gently move to a sandwich that sparked a war. You might be wondering, could a sandwich really tilt the world into war? Take a breath. It's true. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. But the man who fired the bullet, Gavrilo Princip, didn't plan it that way. Earlier that day, his assassination attempt failed. The Archduke's motorcade had driven past too quickly. The other attackers missed, fumbled, or panicked. Princip, disheartened, wandered into a small cafe. He ordered a sandwich. Meanwhile, the Archduke's driver, confused about the route, took a wrong turn and stopped the car right in front of that cafe. Princip looked up, stunned. The target had come to him. The shot rang out. History swerved. World War I ignited. So a lunch break, not a strategy session, became the hinge of empires. And the world changed. Not with a shout, but a bite. Now we drift to a wardrobe that opened a nation's heart. Hey friends, dim the lights and imagine a deep green wool coat, thick against the cold. In 1775, George Washington arrived to the Second Continental Congress. He wasn't yet commander of the Continental Army. He wasn't yet the symbol of American resistance, but he wore that coat, military green, epaulettes, trimmed, proud. Most delegates arrived in breeches and simple cloaks. But Washington's appearance, tall, still, soldierly, captured the room. Without saying a word, his coat spoke. "I am ready." That quiet signal helped push the vote. He was named commander the very next day. No speech, no plea, just fabric and posture. That coat would follow him through winters, valleys, and war. It would eventually hang in the Smithsonian, creased, faded, and folded by history. Sometimes revolution begins not with cannons, but with clothing. Ready to step into the echo of a forgotten bell? You are now standing in the palace courtyard of Beijing, where silence can echo louder than sound. In 1644, the Ming dynasty crumbled. Rebels stormed the capital. The emperor, desperate, looked to summon his guards with the imperial warning bell. But that night, the bell did not ring. Why? A crack in the metal, a fracture hidden for years. When the string was pulled, it produced no sound, only a dull thud. The guards didn't hear. The palace gates remained unguarded. The rebels entered. The emperor fled to a nearby hill and took his own life. That one broken bell, meant to warn, meant to save, simply failed. The Qing dynasty would rise after that night, and the sound that should have echoed through history never came. Isn't it haunting how silence can end an empire? Let's now follow the trail of a diary that toppled secrets. Dear listener, Picture a locked drawer in a quiet house. A notebook rests inside. In 1980s Romania, Nicolae Ceausescu ruled with silence and surveillance. But inside her small apartment, Doina Cornea kept a diary. She recorded hunger, fear, missing neighbors. She copied poems. She translated banned books. Her son found the diary and secretly mailed pages abroad. The West read them. Radio Free Europe quoted her. People began whispering her words in alleys and bakeries. She wasn't a politician, just a professor. But her soft resistance sparked momentum. When Ceausescu fell in 1989, her diary was read aloud in public squares. Words, hidden in pencil and paper, had grown louder than any speech. Isn't it quiet magic, how thoughts on a page can shift power? Next, we'll uncover a sheep that redefined humanity. Hey friends, close your eyes. Imagine a soft ba echoing in a sterile laboratory. In 1996, in a small lab in Scotland, a sheep named Dolly was born. She looked ordinary, ate grass, slept peacefully, but she was extraordinary because she had no father. Dolly was the first mammal cloned from an adult cell. The trigger for this breakthrough? A batch of expired nutrients. Scientists had tried cloning before, but nothing worked until they starved the cells ever so slightly by accident. That gentle stress nudged the DNA into reprogramming. Dolly was born healthy. The science world shook. Ethics, genetics, and biology all reeled. The cloning era had quietly begun, with a mistake in a lab fridge, a sleepy sheep, a faulty formula, a new frontier. Isn't it beautiful how small errors can reveal the greatest doors? Let's now listen to a lullaby that preserved a language. You might be humming softly under your breath now. And that's exactly where this story lives. In 1944, as Stalin's regime deported entire populations, the Chechen language faced extinction. Teachers were silenced. Books were burned. Speaking the tongue became punishable. But one woman, Zara, a village elder, sang lullabies to babies each night. In secret, she hummed legends, prayers, old riddles. Mothers learned from her lips. Grandchildren whispered her tunes. The songs passed, mouth to ear, through wind and snow. When the repression lifted decades later, linguists returned to find something miraculous. The language had survived, in fragments of song. A nation's soul preserved not in ink, but in melody. Isn't it soft wonder how lullabies can carry entire histories? And now, one final whisper, the ink smudge that changed a nation's border. Dear listeners, breathe in deeply and picture a trembling hand drawing a map. In 1919, the Paris Peace Conference redrew the world after World War I. One map, meant to mark the Polish-Czechoslovak border, was hastily copied for the final agreement. But the draftsman's hand shook. The line meant to hug a ridge, dipped by a few miles. Just a smudge. That tiny stroke placed the coal-rich Teschen region inside Polish borders. Czechoslovakia protested. Troops mobilized. A border war flared for 7 days. Thousands displaced, all over a penstroke. Decades later, the area would remain disputed. Families split, flags shifted, all because one tired hand trembled under lamplight. Isn't it humbling how nations can move on the curve of a wrist? Hey friends, if you love this series, don't forget to subscribe, so these whispers of history can keep finding their way to you. You are right now seated at a tiny round table in colonial Boston. Steam rises from a porcelain cup, and history stirs within. In 1773, tensions were rising between the American colonists and the British Crown. But a single porcelain teacup, delicate, imported, and expensive, carried a strange weight. You see, colonial families began boycotting British tea, but they didn't want to give up the performance of tea drinking. So they continued to gather, lifting empty cups filled with herbal substitutes, sassafras, mint, dried raspberry leaves. This symbolic tea became its own protest, soft but loud. And then something curious happened. The very act of substituting gave people time. The Boston Tea Party, the protests, the pamphlets, they built momentum over months. But if anger had boiled over too soon, without ritual to delay it, the revolution may have fractured. The teacup, ironically an object of British fashion, gave people a quiet stage to unite. Can a cup slow down a war? Sometimes. Let's follow now the trail of a telescope that shaped philosophy. Hey friends, dim the lights and tilt your head toward the stars. Imagine peering through a tube of curved glass and seeing something forbidden. In 1609, Galileo Galilei aimed his telescope at the heavens. He wasn't the first to use lenses, but he was the first to turn them toward the moon and take detailed notes. He expected perfect spheres, divine orbs, but he saw craters, shadows, blemishes. Suddenly the heavens weren't flawless. They were geological, imperfect, Earth-like. This small shift shattered centuries of philosophy. If the moon had mountains, perhaps it wasn't so different from Earth. And if that were true, maybe Earth wasn't the center of creation after all. Galileo didn't shout these findings. He published them gently, under titles like Starry Messenger. But kings read it, bishops too, and one fragile sketch of the moon's jagged surface began unraveling the universe's sacred geometry. All thanks to a curved lens and a quiet glance upward. Isn't it strange how vision, both literal and metaphorical, can shift everything? Next, we wander into a baker's oven that changed an election. You might be wondering, can bread decide power? Let's slice gently into the tale. In 1928, Herbert Hoover ran for U.S. president. The economy was booming. Optimism was high. But in rural communities, one line from Hoover's campaign carried weight: a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage. What most people missed was that it wasn't Hoover who said it. It was a Republican ad in a New York newspaper. And still, it stuck. Meanwhile, in a small Kansas town, a baker named Clara Jennings began handing out penny loaves of white bread stamped with those very words. People lined up. They laughed. They felt included. Newspapers caught wind of the stunt. Photos circulated. Soon the bread became the campaign. It wasn't policy that touched voters that fall. It was flour, yeast, and a hopeful line. Hoover won. The bread outlasted the prosperity, as the Depression soon followed. Still, the oven's warmth lingers in history. Isn't it soft irony that bread can carry both promise and warning? Now let's step into a lighthouse that guided a treaty. Dear listeners, close your eyes. You're drifting at sea, cold wind on your cheeks, a single light blinking through the fog. In 1846, Britain and the U.S. were close to war again. The Oregon border was hotly debated. Some wanted to push all the way north to Alaska, but the British Admiralty had a concern: Cape Disappointment. This stretch of coastline near the Columbia River's mouth was treacherous. Many ships had wrecked there, and the U.S. had just completed a lighthouse, one of the strongest on the west coast. British sailors noted the beam, traders felt safer, and quietly, officials began to think, maybe this harbor was worth sharing, not contesting. When the treaty was finally signed, the line was drawn at the 49th parallel. Peace held. And one factor, long forgotten, was a light in the dark. A structure meant for safety had also saved diplomacy. Isn't it peaceful when brightness leads to balance? Let's now unlock a door that started a rebellion. You are now entering a quiet hallway in a Haitian plantation house. It is night. A single key rests on a hook. In 1791, enslaved Haitians were planning something unthinkable: a rebellion. But meetings were dangerous. Any locked door could raise suspicion. A servant named Boukman held a key, not a master key, just one, fitted to a garden cellar door where drums were stored. One night, using that key, rebels gathered in the cellar. They sang. They swore oaths. They planned routes, and when dawn broke, they moved, silently, quickly, with rhythm and strategy. The Haitian Revolution had begun. A single key had opened the space for liberation. That cellar is gone now. The plantation dissolved. but somewhere in the soil lies the shape of that quiet key. Isn't it tender to think how liberty sometimes begins with a small twist of metal? Next, let's follow a misprint that launched a space race. Hey friends, imagine a room full of blinking machines and a single digit blinking wrong. In 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik. But before the Americans responded, NASA's predecessor, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, was busy with math. One set of calculations, meant for rocket trajectory, had a decimal off by one place. The result? They believed the Soviet launch path was closer to the U.S. than it actually was. Panic surged, meetings ignited, budgets soared, and just like that, the U.S. accelerated into the space race. The typo was discovered weeks later, but the momentum stuck. Satellites, moon missions, astronomy schools in rural America. A misplaced dot sent the world upward. Funny how the stars welcomed us through a typing era, right? Let's now curl into a letter that protected a language. You might be curled up now, blanket pulled close, just as letters once sheltered warmth during dark days. In 1928, Turkey replaced the Arabic script with the Latin alphabet. It was swift, sweeping, and controversial. But in one small village, an imam named Mustafa folded a letter into his robe. It was written in the old script, Ottoman Turkish, and signed by his grandfather. He didn't burn it. He didn't forget it. Instead, each night, he read the letter aloud to neighborhood children. He traced the old shapes. He taught their curves. They copied them in sand and dirt. Decades later, linguists arrived and found fluency. That single letter, spoken like scripture, had preserved a dying script in secret, all because one man kept reading. Isn't it comforting how written things can keep breathing? Now we pause at a chessboard that disarmed a war. Dear listener, picture two generals seated across a table. Between them, a game of chess. In 1979, at the height of tensions in the India-Pakistan border region, troop movements neared the breaking point. A standoff was imminent. But two officers, one from each side, had studied at the same British military academy, and during a tense courtesy visit, they recognized each other and recalled their shared love for chess. Rather than discuss troop deployments, they played. For hours, soldiers watched from outside. No orders came, no volleys fired. The next morning, a new negotiation began, one shaped by checkmates and pawns. No treaty was signed, but the standoff dissolved, and the board, folded neatly, returned home with one of the commanders. It now sits in a museum in Lahore next to a handwritten note. Sometimes a quiet mind wins the loudest peace. Wouldn't you agree? Some moves matter more than words. Let's move softly toward a harvest that rewrote a novel. Hey friends, dim the lights and smell the scent of damp pages. In 1816, a volcanic eruption in Indonesia triggered the year without a summer. Skies darkened, crops failed, and in Switzerland, Mary Shelley was stuck indoors at Lake Geneva. She was just 18. The weather trapped them. No walks, no rides, just storms and shivers. To pass the time, they told ghost stories. Then someone said, "Let's each write one." Mary, curled under a blanket, dreamed of a scientist, a creature, a spark. Frankenstein was born in the cold. If the skies had been clear, she might have gone sailing, or sketching, or home early. But instead, the storm carved out a novel that birthed science fiction. And all because ash drifted across the globe and settled into her window panes. Isn't it lovely how the darkest weather sometimes grows the brightest stories? Now one final whisper, a mirror that halted a crime. You are now looking into an old, tarnished mirror, the kind that blurs your face just enough to feel like someone else. In 1605, the gunpowder plot aimed to destroy the English Parliament. Guy Fawkes, the most remembered name, was just one piece. But days before the planned explosion, a letter was delivered, anonymous, vague, and suspicious. It warned a certain lord to avoid Parliament. That lord, visiting a friend, caught a glimpse of the letter in the mirror beside him. The angle revealed something odd, a watermark that marked it as court-issued. Realizing it was from someone close, he brought it to King James. The basement was searched, gunpowder found, the plot unraveled. And that mirror? still hanging in a Yorkshire manor, smudged and silent? Isn't it haunting how reflections sometimes reveal more than our faces? Hey friends, close your eyes and picture a meadow in Kyoto, dew on the grass, a monarch pausing mid-step. In 1867, Japan teetered between feudal tradition and modern reform. Emperor Meiji, then only 15, was being groomed to sign a decree supporting the shogunate's power. But one morning, while walking through the garden to meet his advisors, something happened. A butterfly landed on his sleeve. He paused, just for a moment, and while standing still, he overheard two officials speaking, unguarded, assuming he hadn't arrived. Their words? Deception. He returned inside quietly and asked for new counsel. That day, the signature was delayed. Weeks later, the emperor reversed course, aligning instead with the movement that would launch the Meiji Restoration. Samurai rule ended. Modern Japan emerged. It's hard to say what changed him, but in diaries he wrote about the silence of wings. Isn't it poetic that such transformation might begin with a butterfly? Let's now sit beside a stone that ended an empire. You are right now stepping carefully along the mountain paths of ancient Persia. Stones shift beneath your feet, just as one did beneath a prince. In 330 BCE, Alexander the Great pursued Darius III of Persia. The final battle was days away. But one evening, as the Persian king's eldest son climbed a narrow mountain pass to prepare their retreat, his horse stumbled. Not on a cliff, not in battle, but on a pebble. The prince fell, breaking his leg. Immobilized, he couldn't lead his division. The flank collapsed. Morale shattered. The next day, Alexander's troops surged forward. The Achaemenid Empire, already weakened, was overtaken. The prince would recover, but the empire never did. That pebble, rounded, small, unnoticed, was swept away in the dust. Yet it changed a continent. Isn't it grounding to think that even stones carry history? Now we'll unfold a map that wasn't supposed to exist. Hey friends, dim the lights and unroll a parchment map. Smell old ink. Trace a coastline that was never real. In 1504, Spanish navigators prepared to journey west, but a sailor named Esteban had a problem. His maps didn't match the rumors. To secure funding, he drew a new one. He added an island, just one, slightly southwest of Hispaniola. He named it San Cristobal. That island didn't exist, but the forged map made it into royal hands. Supplies were loaded, ships sent. After weeks at sea, no island appeared. But while rerouting, the fleet spotted an unexpected curve of land, lush, forested, untouched. They had reached what would later be called Puerto Rico. The island on the map had been false, but chasing it had led them somewhere real. A fake place revealed a true one. Esteban's deception faded. The real coastline remained. Isn't it curious how imaginary lines sometimes lead us home? Next, we drift to a ladder that saved a manuscript. Dear listener, take a breath and picture a quiet monastery in the Sinai desert. Sunlight pours through a crack. Dust floats in golden silence. In 1844, a German scholar named Tischendorf was exploring St. Catherine's Monastery. He had been searching for early biblical texts, something ancient, something untouched. One morning, a ladder broke. A monk trying to reach a candle sconce tumbled gently onto a shelf behind the altar. As he steadied himself, he noticed something odd. A tightly bound sheaf of parchment, edges scorched but intact. They were pages of the Codex Sinaiticus, the oldest surviving Bible manuscript. They'd been hidden not by intention, but by time, displaced, forgotten. Tischendorf was shown the pages, and what he found reshaped biblical scholarship, all because a rung had splintered, and behind the candlelight waited history. Isn't it humbling how a misstep can uncover something sacred? Now let's listen to the click of a camera that changed a movement. You are now holding a vintage camera. It clicks softly, frozen time sealed inside a square. In 1955, Emmett Till's murder shook America. but it was his mother's decision that shifted a nation. She chose an open casket, and Jet magazine sent a photographer. The camera, old and flawed, nearly jammed, but it didn't. The photo, harsh, raw, undeniable, reached millions. People who had turned pages now stopped, looked, wept. Among them, Rosa Parks. She would later say that on the bus she thought of Emmett, and that stillness led to a march. Civil rights history often lists names and speeches, but sometimes it starts with a shudder, a silent lens, a single flash, and a mother who wouldn't look away. Isn't it powerful how images whisper across decades? Next, a cup of water interrupts a battle. Hey friends, pour a glass and listen to its calm ripple. In 1099, during the First Crusade, Jerusalem was under siege. The summer heat was punishing. Wells dried, soldiers fainted. But inside the city, a group of women gathered at an ancient Roman cistern. Cool, clear water glistened underground. A child dropped her clay cup. It cracked. Water spilled. But the splash echoed unusually and revealed a hidden passage, an aqueduct that had been sealed for generations. The defenders used it to bring in supplies. The siege stretched longer than expected. Crusaders were forced to reroute. Their delay reshaped not only that battle, but the terms of peace in later campaigns. And the aqueduct? Rediscovered centuries later, the child's name is lost, but the spill remained. A drop can shift a tide. Isn't it amazing how even thirst writes history? Now we travel to a compass that made a poet a hero. You are now standing on the deck of a storm-tossed ship. Wind howls. The compass wobbles. In 1820, Simón Bolívar's ship was caught in the Caribbean. Fog rolled in. Stars vanished. The crew panicked. But Bolívar carried a keepsake, a small magnetic compass gifted by a poet, Andrés Bello. When their ship's larger navigation tools failed, it was Bello's compass, small and handheld, that guided them safely to Haiti. There, Bolívar secured aid for his campaign of independence across South America. Without that compass, he might not have reached shore, or Haiti's support, or the revolution's next stage. He later credited Bello in his journals, and when Venezuela gained freedom, the poet's words were woven into national identity. Isn't it beautiful how direction, both literal and lyrical, can define destiny? Let's now follow a pair of boots that made a surrender. Dear listeners, imagine muddy boots resting outside a door, worn soles, wet laces. In 1865, Ulysses S. Grant rode toward Appomattox Courthouse. He had slept little. Rain soaked the roads. He entered the house late. He wore muddy boots. Muddy. Robert E. Lee, immaculate in pressed gray, looked at him. For a long moment, silence hung. Grant apologized. I didn't expect to be here this soon. Lee nodded and offered terms. The surrender of the Confederate Army wasn't just tactical, it was tonal. Historians say Lee respected Grant's humility, visible in posture, tone, and those boots, no fanfare, just fatigue. And so the war's end began in worn shoes. Isn't it gentle wisdom that how we arrive matters as much as what we say? Now we turn to a bar of soap that saved a composer. Hey friends, breathe in the soft scent of lavender. Let's wash away the noise for a moment. In 1801, Ludwig van Beethoven, already troubled by hearing loss, found himself ill and uninspired. He stayed with a friend who owned a soapworks. Each morning, the composer was gifted a lavender soap to clear the mind. Beethoven later wrote in a letter, "The scent restores order where sound won't." During that visit, he drafted the early movements of his Second Symphony. Critics say the piece is unexpectedly bright, bubbly even, a contrast to his worsening condition. Could it be the soap helped? In his desk, long after, they found dozens of lavender wrappers. Sometimes a bar of soap holds more than fragrance. It holds mood, clarity, a key, isn't it tender how creativity can be coaxed by something so simple? Now one last flutter, a moth that caused a blackout. You are now beside a humming computer in 1947. Warm vacuum tubes glow softly. Then, silence. Rear Admiral Grace Hopper, working on the Harvard Mark II, was used to strange bugs. But one afternoon, a technician opened the machine and found a literal moth trapped in a relay. It had shorted the system. They taped the insect into a logbook and labeled it First Actual Computer Bug. The language stuck. And while the incident didn't halt a war or start a treaty, it did shape how we speak about errors. From that soft-winged glitch came a whole vocabulary of digital life, all thanks to one curious moth and a spark. Isn't it lovely how small things leave large shadows in light? Hey friends, take a moment and picture a single acorn, small, smooth, resting in the palm of your hand. In 1587, Sir Francis Drake led a campaign against the Spanish Armada. England feared an imminent invasion. One evening, while encamped near the coast, Drake's scout tripped, not on a trap, but on the root of a young oak. He landed hard, spotted movement beyond the trees, and discovered an anchored Spanish galleon. The English launched a surprise raid that night. Captured documents revealed new fleet positions. Thanks to this, Drake orchestrated a diversionary fireship attack weeks later, splintering the Spanish formation just as a storm swept in. And it all began with an acorn tree barely 3 feet tall. That tree later grew tall, known as Drake's Oak, until it fell in a gale centuries later. Isn't it beautiful that something so small gave England a breath of time? Next, a stolen cloak that painted a masterpiece. You are now in a Paris attic in 1791. Rain taps on the shutters. A painter lifts his brush. Jacques-Louis David was not yet famous. But one evening, a neighbor's cloak, deep red wool, was stolen, left behind in his studio. Rather than return it, David draped it over a wooden chair and studied its folds. He painted a reclining Roman figure against it, a general from myth, heroic, noble, tragic. That painting became The Death of Marat. Later, when the revolution turned bloodier, David painted Marat again, this time a real martyr. Same palette, same composition, same red cloak. The image gripped France. It was copied on coins, in pamphlets, on walls, all because a discarded coat had once warmed a chair in silence. Art often speaks for movements, but sometimes fabric chooses the brush. Isn't it gentle irony when a thief becomes a muse? Let's now hum through a melody that saved a monument. Hey friends, dim the lights and listen. Soft footsteps echoing under marble arches. In 1914, as World War I reached Belgium, the German army approached the town of Laeken. Their orders: occupy the royal palace. But a young groundskeeper named Louis knew something others didn't. The crown prince had grown fond of a certain tune. A shepherd's melody whistled to call his dog. Louis mimicked it often while tending the garden. When German soldiers advanced toward the gates, they heard the whistle. They hesitated. One officer, educated in Vienna, recognized it. He recalled a photo, the crown prince and his dog in that very garden. The officer ordered the troops to halt. Out of respect or superstition, the palace was left untouched. Later, it served as a shelter for displaced families. A tune, a dog, a whistle in the wind. Isn't it comforting to know that sound can sometimes hold back steel? Now, a bookworm's trail that saved a scripture. Dear listener, imagine old parchment cracked with age. On it, tiny holes in strange patterns. In 1946, a Bedouin boy stumbled into a cave near Qumran. Inside, pottery jars, scrolls, dust, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Scholars were puzzled. How had some of these survived nearly 2,000 years, while others crumbled? One theory traced it back to insects. Scrolls with small, clean wormholes had aired out naturally. The ones sealed too tightly, without breath, had rotted. One curious worm, nibbling parchment, had unknowingly ventilated history. The book of Isaiah, whole and legible, was among them. Sometimes preservation is not perfection, but imperfection. Isn't it fascinating that decay can be the reason something survives? Let's walk now beside a shadow that redirected an assassin. You are now standing in a narrow Vienna alley, early 1900s. A street lamp glows low. Footsteps shuffle. Archduke Franz Ferdinand's cousin, Karl Ludwig, once faced a quiet attempt on his life. A revolutionary waited in the alley with a blade, but at the last moment the assassin stepped back, not from guilt, but from confusion. The street lamp flickered. Its placement cast the Archduke's shadow oddly, larger, slower, doubled. It made him look escorted, guarded. The would-be attacker panicked and fled. Karl would live many more years. And later, in his journals, he would describe an odd twisting of shadow that confused a man's bravery. Electricians later found the bulb had been installed incorrectly, just off-center. A lamp, a slant, a flicker, and a life spared. Isn't it soft wonder how light can trick fate? Next, a coat button that founded a city. Hey friends, imagine a coat swinging in the breeze, one shiny brass button catching the sun. In 1703, Peter the Great scouted land for a new Russian capital. Marshland stretched endlessly. Soldiers, tired and bitter, grumbled. But Peter's eye caught a glint. His officer's button, reflecting sunlight onto a small patch of dry, elevated earth. He rode toward it. The soil, oddly firm. The river's curve, defensive. The breeze, sharp but tolerable. There, he said. And so, St. Petersburg rose. Palaces followed, cathedrals, poetry, revolutions. It wasn't strategy that drew him in first. It was a flash of brass in morning light. A button, a breeze, a birthplace. Isn't it shimmering how sometimes cities begin with a sparkle? Let's now sip a broth that fueled a stand. Dear listener, smell onions, garlic, a hint of pepper. Soup simmering in a crowded kitchen. In 1909, garment workers in New York City faced long hours and low wages. One chilly afternoon, Clara Lemlich, a young organizer, served soup to fellow strikers. The warmth brought them in. She placed a slip of paper under each bowl. Union meeting tonight. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a shout. That night, hundreds gathered. The next day, over 20,000 walked out. The uprising of the 20,000 reshaped labor rights. And the soup? Lentil, thick, hearty. Passed down by Lemlich's mother. Sometimes revolution isn't fed by fire, but by flavor. Isn't it nourishing how change begins around a table? Now a lost shoe that led to discovery. You are now in the Valley of the Kings. Sand shifts. Sun presses on stone. A shoe print appears. In 1922, Howard Carter's team searched for Tutankhamun's tomb. They had all but given up. But one boy, delivering water, noticed his sandal had vanished into the earth. A soft spot. He called out. The team excavated. Beneath a stair, and beneath that, gold, linen, history sleeping beneath centuries of dust. The shoe was never found. But the tomb changed Egyptology forever. A slip, a call, a discovery. Isn't it humbling how great secrets sometimes begin with something missing? Next, a missing screw that paused an invasion. Hey friends, listen for a soft clink, the sound of a screw rolling on stone. In 1940, Nazi engineers tested a bridge near the Belgian border. It was rigged to collapse once tanks passed. But a single bolt, part of the timing mechanism, had been over-tightened. It cracked. The mechanism failed. The bridge stayed standing. Belgian troops crossed back, surprising the German flank. For 3 days, a tiny border town held strong. It didn't win the war, but it delayed it, and that delay saved thousands. The screw was never recovered, but its absence echoed in steel and time. Isn't it quiet rebellion when failure becomes a shield? Now one last flutter, a feather that freed a scholar. You are now walking through an Ottoman courtyard. Pigeons flutter overhead. One feather drifts down. In 1557, a scholar named Rumi Ahmed was imprisoned for preaching reform, but his writings reached the palace. One day, a pigeon feather landed on a guard's nose. He sneezed, dropped his lantern, and broke the lock on a storage chest. Inside, a copy of Ahmed's manuscript. The warden read it, stunned by its beauty. He sent it to the Sultan. Ahmed was freed days later. The feather's fall, graceful, random, had tipped the balance. His teachings would go on to influence poetry across empires. Isn't it peaceful to know that flight and fate sometimes dance? Hey friends, take a slow step across an old cobbled path. Now pause, because there's a puddle just ahead. In 1832, Britain was simmering with reform debates. One rainy morning, Lord Grey, the Prime Minister, approached Parliament in haste. But as he exited his carriage, he stepped into a deep puddle. Muddy water soaked his silk stockings. Embarrassed and shivering, he entered the chamber flustered and forgot the speech he'd rehearsed. Instead of his usual reserved tone, he spoke plainly, honestly. To his surprise, the Commons listened, really listened. The tide turned. A few undecided votes shifted. Days later, the Reform Act passed. His wet feet helped democracy take a step forward. Isn't it oddly soothing to think that sometimes progress begins with discomfort? Next, a paperweight that delayed disaster. You are now seated at a desk in Berlin, 1938. A paperweight holds down fragile telegrams, one smooth stone, round and solid. As Hitler's generals prepared their final plans for an invasion of Czechoslovakia, a courier tripped and knocked the desk. Papers scattered. But one paperweight, a gift from a soldier's daughter, landed on the floor and cracked. The general, sentimental, paused to examine it. That moment's delay allowed a revised message to arrive. Britain was ready to negotiate. The invasion was postponed. That extra day became Munich's moment. Appeasement, however flawed, extended peace for one more year. And all because a keepsake stayed heavy when the room felt light. Isn't it calming how a pause, even from a fall, can shift the winds? Let's now glide into a breeze that silenced a cannon. Hey friends, picture yourself atop a cliffside fort in 1759. Cannons line the walls. Below, sails shimmer on the sea. During the 7 Years' War, British forces prepared to bombard French-held Quebec. The artillery was set. Fuses were ready. But then, an autumn wind rolled in. Not violent, just steady. It blew smoke from early cannon tests directly back into British lines, obscuring vision, stinging eyes. The bombardment was delayed. Meanwhile, French troops repositioned. The battle that followed was closer than expected, and history calls it the battle that almost didn't happen. The fort was eventually taken, but many believe that gentle wind, at that precise moment, preserved hundreds of lives and changed British war tactics forever. Isn't it peaceful to think that nature often writes the footnotes? Now we descend a staircase that preserved a library. Dear listener, imagine your foot slipping slightly on a smooth marble stair. A moment of surprise, a hand brushing a dusty wall. In 1906, an earthquake shook Athens. Buildings trembled. The National Library cracked and groaned. A curator named Eleni was guiding students down a back staircase when she slipped. Her hand pressed a stone that shifted slightly inward. Behind it, cool air and a hidden chamber. Later inspection revealed a small sealed room filled with forgotten texts, ancient epics, letters, fragments of plays. They had been sealed off during renovations in the 1700s and left undocumented. The quake had nearly destroyed them, but a stumble uncovered them instead. Isn't it lovely that sometimes falling forward means falling into wonder? Let's now warm our hands beside a coal that fueled freedom. You are now in a cold Berlin apartment in 1848. A single stove glows, coal crackles. Karl Marx sat writing the Communist Manifesto. But paper was low and his ink froze overnight. One morning, his daughter Jenny placed a hot coal in a kettle and held it under his writing desk to keep the ink flowing. In that warmth, Marx wrote the lines that would echo across revolutions and debates for centuries. It wasn't ideology alone. It was survival, parenting, and one hot ember in winter. A child's gesture warmed more than fingers. It warmed the very words of change. Isn't it tender how warmth carries more than heat? Next, a squeaky hinge that gave away a spy. Hey friends, step into a quiet manor in 1935. The door creaks softly, not from rust, but from secrets. In London, British intelligence tracked rumors of a mole. Suspicion lingered around a diplomat named Vernon. One evening he slipped into a private office after hours, planning to steal a coded telegram, but the door betrayed him. A squeaky hinge, long ignored, squealed slightly as he eased it shut. A cleaning maid, startled by the sound, alerted a night watchman. They caught him minutes later. He hadn't taken the document yet, but his intent was sealed in sound. That hinge, old, dry, unnoticed, protected information that altered negotiations with Spain. Isn't it curious how ungreased metal can shield a nation? Now let's trace a recipe that inspired rebellion. Dear listener, breathe in. Cinnamon, clove, buttery crust. A pie cools on a windowsill. In 1911, in Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, women worked long hours under unsafe conditions. One worker, Rosa, brought in her aunt's spiced apple pie. She shared it quietly. Co-workers paused, smiled. The pie became a ritual every Friday. They began to gather outside after shifts, then to talk, then to plan. That small gesture of comfort became a symbol. The fire that followed months later devastated the factory. But Rosa survived. She went on to lead one of the most successful garment union campaigns in New York, and it all started with a shared dessert. Isn't it soft truth that comfort and courage often rise from the same oven? Next, a mirror crack that shaped a queen's fate. You are now in a gilded chamber in Versailles. Gold glints, and on the wall, a mirror, slightly cracked. In 1770, Marie Antoinette entered the Hall of Mirrors before her wedding to Louis XVI. She paused, admiring her reflection, but she noticed the flaw, barely visible. "Perhaps I am too young," she reportedly said. "I see two of me." Courtiers dismissed it, but the moment was etched into gossip, poems, and later, pamphlets from revolutionaries. They mocked the mirror bride, symbolizing her duality, queen and stranger. It shaped public perception, planting seeds of alienation. The mirror remained until it was replaced in 1791, just before her arrest. Was it a trick of glass, or a window into destiny? Isn't it eerie how reflections sometimes shape reality? Now let's follow a chalk mark that ended a career. Hey friends, feel the roughness of slate under your fingertips. Now imagine one tiny chalk X. In 1948, at a U.S. political convention, a rising senator prepared to deliver a fiery speech. He rehearsed backstage, pacing a floor that stagehands had marked to indicate safe camera angles. But one assistant, sweeping too fast, erased half of a chalk mark. During the broadcast, the senator stepped just past the frame. His delivery was powerful, but viewers only saw half his face. Newspapers mocked the half-headed man. His momentum faded. A rival rose in his place, Harry Truman, who would go on to become president. A missing line of chalk, and a line in history was rerouted. Isn't it humbling how careers can pivot on something so fleeting? Now one final story for tonight, a napkin that preserved a pack. Dear listener, dim the lights. Imagine a cafe in Geneva. Tables clink, glasses clatter. A waiter scribbles. In 1962, during Cold War backchannels, two diplomats met quietly in a restaurant. They discussed disarmament, but had no paper. The waiter, amused, brought them a clean cloth napkin. They drafted talking points on it using a borrowed fountain pen. That napkin was folded, pocketed, and later used to draft portions of the nuclear test ban treaty. It now sits in a private archive, yellowed, ink-stained, and quietly powerful. Isn't it lovely to think that a humble square of linen helped soften the loudest decade? Hey friends, if you're still here and floating through history with us, don't forget to subscribe. We've got 40 more whispered wonders waiting to be told. You are now walking along a Welsh trail where mists hang low and stones crunch underfoot. In 1282, King Edward I of England pursued the last native Welsh prince, Llywelyn ap Gruffydd. The crown of independent Wales teetered on its final hope. But one icy morning, as Llywelyn crossed a streambed near Silmeri, his horse slipped. A single pebble, rounded, wet, had loosened beneath the hooves. Llywelyn fell behind his men. alone, separated. He was soon surrounded by enemy scouts. The prince was killed. His banner fell. Wales would never have another sovereign ruler. And yet, that quiet stone, smooth from centuries of river song, lies near a monument where moss now grows. Isn't it gentle sorrow to know how easily the world can tilt? Next, a forgotten birthday that redrew a continent. Hey friends, light a candle in your mind. One small flame flickering above marzipan and cream. In 1864, two diplomats, one French, one Prussian, met at a neutral lodge to finalize a border agreement over Alsace. But that day happened to be the Prussian's birthday. His French counterpart, unaware, had forgotten it entirely. The lodge owner, a kind old woman, baked a cake anyway. She placed it quietly between them, whispering, "Everyone deserves a sweet on their day." Touched by the gesture, the Prussian offered a small concession, an adjusted line on the map. It was accepted. That sliver of land, barely 10 miles wide, would later play roles in 2 world wars. Its people, language, and culture danced between nations, all from a cake with 3 candles and a kindness unintended. Isn't it sweet to imagine borders softened by butter and sugar? Now a raincoat that rewrote fashion and morale. Dear listener, imagine the sound of rain tapping gently on rubber. In 1941, British morale was faltering. The Blitz had darkened skies and spirits alike. Factories, homes, markets, scarred and shaken. But one morning, Queen Elizabeth, later known as the Queen Mother, walked through bombed streets wearing something curious, a bright blue Macintosh raincoat. It wasn't silk, it wasn't royal, it was standard issue. Photos of her circulated across newspapers, smiling, wet, among rubble. The coat, practical and vivid, became a symbol. Sales soared. Factory workers sewed faster. Women in London began calling them courage coats. A garment meant for drizzle helped restore shine. And still today, that coat hangs in the Imperial War Museum. Isn't it warm when fabric carries more than weather? Let's now follow a trail of sugar that quieted a revolution. Hey friends, stir a spoon through your tea. Listen to the clink. Taste the sweetness. In 1857, the Indian Rebellion against the British East India Company raged. But in one town, Lucknow, a planned uprising stalled. The reason? A crate of sugar. During a temple celebration, British soldiers gifted sugar loaves to local leaders. Not out of politics, but tradition. The gesture was simple and unusual. One rebel leader, touched by the offering, hesitated. He delayed his troops. The moment passed. Rebellion still burned, but Lucknow's uprising was different. More negotiation, fewer flames. Historians argue over how much sugar mattered, but the delay shifted the timeline of the siege. A cube, a pause, a change. Isn't it curious how sweet things sometimes hold sharp consequences? Now a candle stub that saved a speech. You are now sitting at a desk in Philadelphia, 1787. Ink stains your fingers. A quill taps gently. Thomas Jefferson was known for writing late into the night. But on one crucial evening, drafting a response to anti-federalist critics, his candles had nearly burned out. All but one. A short, stubborn stub of wax gifted by Benjamin Franklin as a joke. Jefferson lit it, laughed, then kept writing. The essay, A Dialogue Between the States, was reprinted widely. It reframed unity. It softened skeptics, and the wax, though brief, had brightened long enough to shape opinion. The candle stub? Melted. Gone. But its glow lingered in the lines of compromise. Isn't it tender how light, no matter how short, can echo? Now a broken handle that held off war. Hey friends, grip an old wooden door handle. It's warm from sun and years of use. In 1806, tensions flared between Austria and France. A small town near the Rhine was ordered to host an emergency diplomatic summit. But when the Austrian envoy arrived, the manor's front door wouldn't open. The handle had cracked. For 30 minutes, servants struggled. Embarrassed, they brought tea outside beneath a walnut tree. There the two sides began to speak freely, before formalities, before uniforms. They found unexpected common ground. The meeting ended in agreement. No shots fired that month, no soldiers marched, and the door? Still stuck. It's now preserved, handle and all, behind glass in a local museum. Isn't it beautiful how what fails to open sometimes opens everything? Let's next ride the gust that saved a fleet. Dear listener, picture a flag, heavy and wet, refusing to rise. But then, a breeze. In 1805, Admiral Nelson's fleet prepared to engage the French at Trafalgar. He had a signal ready. England expects that every man will do his duty. But the flag cords jammed, wet from mist, slack. For several tense minutes, sailors waited. Morale wavered. Then a single gust lifted the lines. The flag snapped into view. Cheering followed. Cannons readied. The battle commenced. Nelson would fall that day, but the message endured. Britain's naval supremacy was cemented. And the wind? Silent, undirected, but perfectly timed. Isn't it calming to know how nature sometimes delivers our words? Now, let's step into the soil that guarded a secret. You are now crouched in the Polish countryside, a spade in your hand, earth rich and damp. In 1940, as German forces seized Warsaw, a family buried their Torah scrolls beneath an orchard. They marked the spot beside an apple tree, but when returning to retrieve them, the tree had fallen. Its trunk had shifted, the location lost. Years later, in 1963, a farmer unearthed the scrolls while planting carrots. Their preservation? Credited to a thick root which had grown beneath the chest, keeping water away. One root, winding quietly, had saved centuries of memory. The scrolls were restored and are now read aloud on holy days. Isn't it grounding how the earth holds history in its embrace? Now a fly that stopped a vote. Hey friends, listen for the soft buzz of wings in a quiet chamber. In 1898, during a critical vote in the French Senate regarding colonial reforms, one politician, known for long deliberations, sat ready to cast the final vote. As he raised his hand, a fly landed on his nose. He swatted reflexively, then paused, laughed. The break lasted just long enough for a colleague to whisper an objection. Discussion reopened. The amendment was postponed. Later analysis showed that single delay reshaped military policy in Indochina, all because of one winged interruption. The fly? Long gone, but its brief landing shifted the course of debate. Isn't it fascinating how even annoyances can offer clarity? And now, our final whisper for tonight. A drawer that preserved a dream. You are now gently opening an old desk in Atlanta. Papers rest inside, faded but safe. In 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. drafted early thoughts for a speech. He labeled the folder, March, Dream, but then Travel, Urgency. He forgot the draft in his desk drawer. When he stood before the crowd in Washington, he began with scripted lines. Then, prompted by Mahalia Jackson's voice, tell them about the dream. He spoke from memory, heart, rhythm. The original draft stayed hidden for weeks. The version the world heard, improvised. The speech we remember, iconic, eternal, wasn't read. It was recalled. And the drawer? Still intact in the King Center. Isn't it extraordinary that forgetting something can lead to remembering everything? Hey friends, close your eyes and imagine a single snowflake landing on the tip of your mitten. In 1812, Napoleon's army retreated from Moscow. Winter tightened its grip. Soldiers fell by the thousands. But the turning point didn't arrive with a blizzard. It arrived with a flake. On November 6th, just after sunrise, the first snowflake of the season drifted down. It was light, unassuming, but the moment it touched the damp ground, it signaled the freeze. Roads turned to ice, wheels cracked, horses slipped, food wagons toppled. The retreat slowed to a crawl. What had been a calculated fallback turned into collapse. Later, Russian generals marked that morning as the moment the French defeat became inevitable. And it all began with a feather of frost. Isn't it beautiful how gently history sometimes begins to fall? Let's now trace a wrinkle that redirected a treaty. You are now unfolding a parchment on a long oak table. The crease runs straight, but ever so slightly off. In 1713, diplomats from Britain and Spain finalized the Treaty of Utrecht, ending a long and bitter war. The documents were copied by hand and sealed with wax. But a junior scribe in London folded one version improperly. A name, Minorca, became partly obscured. When it arrived in Madrid, the word was misread as Majorca, a nearby island with vastly different implications. This confusion prompted urgent clarification. New terms were added. Spain ceded Minorca fully, not partially, entirely due to a wrinkle in vellum. Cartographers adjusted their maps. Merchants rerouted. Decades of tension softened. And that scribe he never knew. One fold, one glance, one altered coastline. Isn't it quietly astonishing how diplomacy can hinge on a crease? Now a puddle of ink that sparked a movement. Dear listener, imagine writing by candlelight. The nib scratches softly. Then, a blot. In 1847, Friedrich Engels drafted early ideas for a workers' pamphlet. A sentence read, "The working class has only to unite in," but his pen dripped a thick ink blot right on the word defense. Annoyed, he rewrote the phrase, "The working class has only their chains to lose." It sounded stronger, sharper, more poetic. When Marx read the edit, he paused. "Keep it," he said. The line became the soul of the Communist Manifesto, and the blot, still visible on one early draft, round, blue, stubborn. One drop of impatience birthed a rallying cry. Isn't it humbling how some of history's loudest echoes begin with a quiet spill? Let's move now to a kite string that shifted science. Hey friends, dim the lights and picture a boy holding a homemade kite, paper fluttering, string taut between fingers. In 1752, Benjamin Franklin flew a kite into a storm, hoping to prove lightning carried electricity. But what few remember is that his original string was too thick. It would have grounded the charge. It was Franklin's son, William, who swapped it for a silk string used in gift wrapping. It wasn't meant for science, just spare ribbon in the kitchen drawer. But silk held moisture differently. It carried the charge without snapping. That shock, caught in a key, became proof. It electrified future generations, literally and figuratively, all thanks to a child's choice and a kitchen spool. Isn't it thrilling that discovery can rest in our fingertips? Now a cracked teacup that ended a feud. You are now in a candlelit salon in Copenhagen, 1863. Porcelain clinks gently. A chip catches the light. Denmark and Prussia stood at the edge of conflict. The Danish queen, hosting a quiet reception, served tea in her family's finest set. But one teacup, her favorite, was cracked. She offered it to the Prussian ambassador by mistake. He noticed, paused, then laughed. Even queens sip from imperfect cups. She blushed, replied, "Only those who've endured wars understand that." That shared moment of humility softened the evening. The ambassador's report later influenced the tone of negotiations. War was postponed. A more peaceful compromise was explored. And the cup? Still displayed, crack and all, in a royal collection. Isn't it soothing to know diplomacy can start with a chip and a chuckle? Now a forgotten candle that guided a composer. Hey friends, imagine candle wax melting slowly down brass. A piano waits in stillness nearby. In 1801, Beethoven, nearly deaf and despairing, wandered Vienna. He entered a dark room, heard music, a blind girl playing by memory. Moved, he offered to accompany her, but the room was nearly dark. Only one candle remained, left behind by a tenant in haste. It flickered long enough for Beethoven to improvise beside her. Later that night, he wrote what would become the Moonlight Sonata. He called it a song for a candle and a soul. That flame, unintended, gave warmth to a moment, and music to eternity. Isn't it peaceful how light and silence sometimes write together? Next, a delay in stitching that changed a flag. Dear listener, picture a seamstress pausing, thread in hand, eyes closed for just a moment. In 1776, Betsy Ross was sewing the first American flag. Her original pattern included stars arranged in rows, but she ran out of blue thread midway. While waiting for more, she rearranged the pattern in a circle, just for fun. When the committee returned, they preferred it. Unity, they said. Equality among states. That circle endured. Later versions grew, changed, but always circled back to the stars. A spool's delay, a stitch of imagination, a symbol forever altered. Isn't it graceful how symbols evolve in pause? Now let's walk beside a breeze that saved a manuscript. Hey friends, picture paper flapping beside an open window, ink drying slowly. The air carries a whisper. In 1605, William Shakespeare was finalizing a draft of King Lear. A storm outside shook the shutters. He had left the window open. But just as the wind picked up, the door slammed shut. The draft stayed in place. Had the breeze pulled the pages out, the entire third act, still unsealed, might have vanished. Shakespeare thanked the fury without and the calm within. Centuries later, scholars found marginalia. Window shut in time, pages spared. The door still swings at the Globe Theater? Isn't it gentle fortune that great stories sometimes rest on hinges? Now a cracked lens that guided the moon. You are now gazing at a telescope in Pasadena, 1966. A thin crack runs through one lens, just off-center. NASA's engineers tested a moon landing simulator. A photographer, adjusting focus, swapped lenses last minute due to a crack in his primary. But the crack forced him to zoom wider. That wider photo revealed an unseen slope in the simulation, later discovered on the Sea of Tranquility. They adjusted descent protocols based on it. And in 1969, when Apollo 11 descended, that slope was avoided entirely. A cracked lens, a clearer view, one giant leap. Isn't it quiet reassurance that sometimes flaws sharpen our focus? And now, one final ripple, a dropped coin that rerouted a train. Hey friends, hear the clink of a coin bouncing on steel. Distant wheels approach. In 1912, a conductor in Vienna dropped a coin while inspecting train tracks. It rolled between the rails and slipped into a crevice. He bent down, noticed something else, a stress fracture in the metal. He halted the train just in time. Among the passengers, a young Archduke Charles, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. Had the train continued, disaster might have struck. He would later become emperor and sign the armistice to end World War I. The coin, lost. But that echo, the pause, the bend, the glance still lingers. Isn't it calming how even small falls can lift futures? Hey friends, picture a warm loaf of bread, not eaten, but thrown. In 1529, Vienna was under siege by the Ottoman Empire. Food was scarce, morale low, but one baker, Johann, had hidden dough in his chimney to avoid theft. On the morning the city was rumored to fall, Johann tossed out the overbaked loaf. It had turned hard as stone. It flew over the wall and struck a helmet below. The enemy soldiers, startled, believed it to be a message or a mockery. Confusion spread. The attack paused. Scouts retreated. That same day, imperial reinforcements arrived. The Ottomans withdrew. Later, Johann's bakery became famous for its victory loaf, a dry, crusty symbol of unexpected defiance. Isn't it lovely how a stale mistake became a fresh beginning? Let's follow now a sneeze that silenced a rebellion. Dear listener, imagine a grand ballroom, velvet drapes, golden candlelight. Then, achoo. In 1772, conspirators in Poland planned to assassinate a visiting Russian envoy during a formal dance. Everything was timed, disguises in place, weapons tucked beneath coats. But as the ambassador entered, one of the plotters sneezed, loudly. Suddenly, his powdered wig slipped sideways. Everyone turned. Startled, he fumbled, dropped a pistol. It clattered across the floor. Panic, confession, arrests. The rebellion sputtered before it began. That sneeze, caused by a feather-lined collar, is noted in court records. A tiny tickle unraveled a grand conspiracy. Isn't it strange how breath, dust, and timing can turn history's pages? Next, a shoelace that collapsed to speech. Hey friends, picture yourself pacing a quiet hallway before a big moment. You glance down, and your shoe's untied. In 1960, John F. Kennedy prepared for his first televised debate with Richard Nixon. Confidence high, script polished. But moments before stepping on stage, his aide noticed JFK's shoelace had come loose. They bent, fixed it, and in doing so, delayed Kennedy just long enough to overhear the tail end of Nixon's final prep line. "Don't smile too much. It'll look insincere." Kennedy tucked that away. He smiled often during the debate, warmly, subtly. Viewers were charmed. Historians would later call it the first TV debate won by appearance. And the shoelace? Just cotton, but laced with perfect timing. Isn't it comforting to think that small knots sometimes hold great victories? Now a goose feather that touched a king. You are now seated in a candlelit chamber where parchment rustles gently. A feather rests in ink. In 1604, King James III commissioned a new translation of the Bible. Dozens of scholars debated language, cadence, and tone. But the king himself was swayed by something delicate, the softness of a goose feather. He had once written a letter with a sharp swan quill. Too rigid, it tore the paper. But a monk offered a goose feather, smooth, pliant, even forgiving. James noted the gentleness. Let our word be likewise. That moment influenced the final tone, poetic, flowing, and soft in rhythm. A bird's plume had set the mood for the world's most read book. Isn't it poetic that softness can shape scripture? Let's turn now to a bee that buzzed through a council. Hey friends, feel the warmth of sunlight through old windows. Listen, buzzing near your ear. In 1881, a council in Paris debated funding for the Eiffel Tower. Votes were split. Arguments swirled like chimney smoke. During the tense final session, a bee entered through an open window. It darted toward a glass of absinthe, then into a powdered wig. One councilman shrieked and stumbled. Laughter broke the silence. The vote resumed, with lightness in the room. The swing voter, previously unsure, said, "If a tower can stand taller than a bee flies, let us build it." The motion passed. The bee disappeared, unfazed. Isn't it wonderful when humor lands on wings? Next, a mirror smudge that inspired a flag. Dear listener, imagine standing before a tall mirror with streaks from the morning sun. In 1913, during the design of India's independence banner, a young artist tried to sketch symbols on fabric, but the mirror he used for symmetry had a smear. That smudge blurred the center, so he offset the spinning wheel ever so slightly. The result was unintentional, but striking. It gave the flag balance, movement, identity. When Gandhi saw it, he smiled. Imperfect tools reveal perfect meaning. The flag would evolve, but the off-center wheel remained. And the mirror? Still in the artist's family home, proudly uncleaned. Isn't it endearing how clarity sometimes comes through blur? Now a torn curtain that uncovered a plan. Hey friends, dim the lights. Picture a velvet curtain fluttering in a quiet parlor. In 1865, just days after Lincoln's assassination, investigators searched homes in Washington. One parlor held nothing suspicious until a torn curtain caught on a man's cufflink. Behind it, hidden in the wall, was a rolled-up map marked with escape routes. It exposed the broader conspiracy. Arrests followed swiftly. The tear had been made days earlier by a curious cat chasing dust. A claw, a tug, a curtain twitch, and a secret came undone. Isn't it curious how animals sometimes open hidden truths? Let's now look through a keyhole that glimpsed a future. You are now peering through a keyhole in an old weather observatory. In 1871, meteorologists in Chicago debated the likelihood of a storm. Data conflicted. But one assistant noticed something else. Condensation on the inside of the brass keyhole. A strange pattern. It mimicked a pressure drop seen before hurricanes. He alerted his superior. Warnings went out. Trains were halted. A town evacuated. Later, the storm hit hard, but with far fewer casualties. The keyhole method was studied for years, though never fully replicated. Still, it lingers. A lock, a fog, a quiet prediction. Isn't it peaceful to think that sometimes doors whisper warnings? now a feathered hat that crowned a movement. Hey friends, picture a flamboyant feather bobbing through the streets. A hat, a statement. In 1908, a woman named Mary marched alone for suffrage in London. No banner, no crowd, but her hat, towering, purple, with a sweeping ostrich plume, turned heads. Reporters noticed. The next march, 10 women, all in hats, then 50, then thousands. The feather became a symbol of elegant defiance. Later, Mary said, "I wore my loudest hat because I had no voice yet." That voice would echo into votes, laws, and legacy. Isn't it lovely how style sometimes starts a stand? And now one last bloom, a flower that saved a city. Dear listener, lean into spring. The scent of blossoms on the breeze. Hope in petals. In 1944, Rome had suffered months of drought. Wells dried, tempers flared. But one morning, a jasmine flower bloomed out of season on the Vatican wall. Locals took it as a sign. They held a silent procession. No banners, no speeches, just candles and flowers. The next day, rain arrived. Whether coincidence or faith, the rain softened roads and postponed a planned bombing. That quiet delay helped rescue hundreds. The flower, pressed between Bible pages, still rests in a chapel drawer. Isn't it comforting that beauty sometimes buys us time? In 1760, Empress Elizabeth of Russia entertained 2 visiting nobles with tea. Each had a different agenda for her succession. To calm nerves, a servant brought in fresh spoons, but one, a gift from a rival house, had a family crest etched faintly on the handle. The Empress noticed. She said nothing, but later she changed her will. That one emblem, too small for most to see, cast doubt on loyalty and placed Catherine, her daughter-in-law, next in line. Russia would never be the same. And the spoon? Still polished, still engraved, still nestled in a case beneath the Winter Palace. Isn't it striking how even silence can speak when silver glimmers? Let's follow now a draft of wind that spared a library. Dear listener, you are now standing in a library's top floor. Books stretch upward. A window's open. In 1943, during the bombing of Hamburg, fire raced through buildings. At the local university, flames spread from rooftop to reading room. But a single window, cracked open on the 4th floor, caught a gust of wind. That breeze slammed a fireproof door shut. Books were saved, thousands of them, including medieval manuscripts and first editions. The fire never crossed that threshold. Later, a librarian hung a sign on the door, "Protected by air." Isn't it lovely how invisible things can shield the visible? Now a shoebox that secured a crown. Hey friends, dim the lights and imagine a dusty shoebox, tied with twine and tucked beneath floorboards. In 1936, Edward VIII was torn between the throne and love. But long before his abdication, the press had gathered damning letters, private, passionate, controversial. A junior editor at one paper, troubled by the invasion of privacy, tucked a bundle of them into a shoebox and hid it. Without those letters, the scandal softened. The king still stepped down, but with less venom, more grace. Wallace Simpson left the country, and the monarchy, bruised but unbroken, endured. Years later, the shoebox surfaced, sealed and unread. Isn't it gentle wisdom that withholding sometimes preserves more than exposing? Now a faint bell that warned a ship. You are now drifting on a foggy sea. The air is still. A bell clangs, faint and rhythmic. In 1907, the SS Republic neared Boston Harbor through thick mist. The crew, disoriented, nearly collided with a smaller fishing vessel. But the fisherman, old, patient, had tied a cowbell to his mast. Not a proper foghorn, just a clangy barn bell. It wasn't loud, but it was rhythmic, distinct. The Republic altered course just in time. That cowbell, once used to summon animals, had summoned awareness. Both ships docked safely. And the bell hung above a stove for years, worn by salt, soot, and stories. Isn't it calming to know that even clumsy sounds can find the right ears? Now a cracked teapot that changed a vote. In 1837, New Zealand's tribal chiefs met British representatives to debate the Treaty of Waitangi. Tensions stirred. One elder refused to sit. Then a teapot cracked over the fire. The sound startled him, and he burst out laughing. Others joined in. The mood shifted. The elder agreed to hear the proposal. The treaty wasn't perfect, but the laugh softened hearts. And the teapot? Preserved in a glass case near the original parchment. A fracture made in fire led to the start of nationhood. Isn't it beautiful when laughter comes through steam? Next, a misplaced coat that made a president. Dear listener, imagine a cold gust at twilight. A young man shrugs into someone else's coat. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln arrived for a speech in Peoria. His own coat lost in transit. He borrowed one from a hotel clerk. Too large, slightly faded, but warm. That coat had a small tear near the cuff. When Lincoln lifted his hand mid-speech, it flapped. The audience smiled, laughed, listened. His stories, homespun, plain-spoken, landed deeper in that moment of humanity. Newspapers described him as relatable, worn, like us. He gained traction not in grandeur, but in borrowed fabric. And the coat? Lost to time, but remembered in tone. Isn't it comforting that dignity often walks in borrowed sleeves? Now a ladder that paused a rebellion. Hey friends, tilt your head toward a stone wall at night. Hear quiet breaths and the rattle of wood. In 1354, prisoners in Avignon plotted escape. A rebellion waited outside the gates, timed to their breakout. But the ladder, smuggled inside, was 6 rungs too short. The final man dangled mid-air, then fell, breaking his leg. The others scrambled back inside. The rebellion mistimed. The guards noticed nothing. The uprising fizzled. And the man? He later became a monk, saying, "Heaven has strange ways of climbing. The ladder still leans in the monastery cellar unfinished. Isn't it gentle irony when plans fall just short of the edge?" Next, a whisper behind a curtain. You are now listening through velvet drapes, the sound of slippers across marble. In 1913, a Balkan prince hesitated to support a coup. But at an opera, during intermission, he overheard 2 aristocrats mocking him. Too soft to rule, too silent to strike. They didn't see him behind the curtain. He returned home and signed the papers that night. The coup succeeded. Some say the words weren't even about him, but the echo struck deep. The opera, Carmen, the curtain, still rises nightly. Isn't it strange how shadows overhear what light cannot? Now a snapped string that freed a nation. Hey friends, picture a violinist on stage. One string snaps mid-note, gasps, silence. In 1945, a concert was held in war-torn Prague. Tensions between locals and occupying forces rippled like smoke. But the soloist, Czech-born, calm, paused, retuned, and continued, playing the rest on 3 strings. The audience wept, soldiers too. That night, a planned protest was called off. The crowd dispersed in peace, singing instead of marching. The next day, negotiations reopened. The broken string still rests in the Prague National Theater, coiled in a glass case. Isn't it remarkable how music can mend more than melody? And now, one final echo, a coin flip that sealed a city. In 1851, 2 leaders in Oregon Territory argued over the capital's location, Salem or Corvallis. Tired out of options, they flipped a coin. The first toss landed in mud. They flipped again. Salem won. Soon after, the capital was built. Lawmakers, libraries, lives arranged around a silver decision. The coin, scratched and bent, was found decades later under floorboards during renovations. It had chosen the center of a state. Isn't it humbling that chance sometimes writes the maps? And with that, our 100 stories close, like pages folded in quiet. Hey friends, if you loved this series, thank you for wandering through these whispers with me. Rest easy now. History is still dreaming.